Hello, and welcome to Building Broadband Better, a webinar supported by the Michigan State University Center for Community and Economic Development Comprehensive Economic Recovery Initiative, a CARES Act supplemental funded project as a part of the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration, MSU University Center for Regional Economic Innovation. I am Jennifer Bruin, the Assistant Director at the Michigan State University Center for Community and Economic Development. I'm joined today by Mitchell Shapiro, who will serve as facilitator for this important event. Mitch has worked as an independent consultant and author in the telecommunication industry for 35 years. For the past decade, he has applied his broad and deep knowledge of technology, policy, and business issues to the challenge of expanding high-performance broadband and its benefits in underserved areas. Mitch's recent work includes a 2019 REI collaborative learning plan entitled Electric Cooperatives and the Digital Divide, helping connect rural Americans to 21st century opportunity. He also served as a 2020 EDA REI University Center Innovation Fellow, focusing on developing strategies and alliances to expand broadband access throughout Michigan. He has also worked with MSU's Quello Center, he's co-authored and a report examining innovative technologies and strategies to extend broadband connectivity, and a policy brief focused on strategies to bridge Michigan's digital divides. Mitch's interest in community networks dates to the early 1980s. As a graduate student, he co-authored a guidebook for communities interested in creating cooperatively owned cable TV networks. Since then, he has continued to research and write about the feasibility and benefits of community-owned broadband networks, including a community fiber guidebook published in 2008 by the Public Technology Institute. He is also the founder and author of the Evolving Human Systems blog. Mitch holds a BA in economics from the University of Michigan and an MA in telecommunications from Michigan State University. Are you there, Mr. Shapiro?
I am. You can hear me, I hope.
Yes. Are you ready to get started, Mitch?
Sure, yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Jen. And before I introduce the webinar, I want to thank the team at MSU Center for Community and Economic Development for the work they do and their support for my work in this area for the last few years. To me, the center is a kind of a Johnny Appleseed, leveraging modest resources to plant seeds of progress, some of which sprout into important ideas, projects, and enterprises. I hope we can plant some such seeds today. So again, my thanks to Rex, John, Jen, and the center's team, with special thanks to Brogan Eisler, who you can see up there, at least his name, for the many roles he's played to make this happen. So let me continue. So anyway, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time to join today. And I hope you'll learn some things that will help you make good decisions about how to improve broadband connectivity in your community, your region, and your state. As the past 18 months of dealing with COVID has made painfully clear, the need to make these improvements is urgent. Fortunately, the federal government is stepping up to help states and communities address that need. While this expansion of federal funding is obviously good news, it requires states and communities to make decisions quickly, but also with their long-term needs and goals in mind. This can be very challenging. This webinar is intended to help you make these decisions wisely by providing information about a particular approach to upgrading broadband access that we refer to as community empowerment networks. While this approach may not be the right one for every community, we believe it has important advantages that broadband planners and decision makers should be aware of as they evaluate the various options. So among the things we hope you'll learn from this webinar are why fiber optics is the only truly future-ready communication technology, what automated open access technologies are and how they support healthy competition and innovation and empower community stakeholders, both public and private. Emerging models based on the principles of community empowerment networks, and which of these may be best suited for the needs, goals, and resources of your community. And also what you can do to help bring pandemic and future-ready broadband to your community. To set the stage, we're going to play a 20-minute video that introduces a community empowerment network model. This will be followed by a presentation by Entry Point Networks. That will be Bruce speaking first. And Entry Point has developed key technologies that support this model, as you'll learn more. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to submit questions that come to mind as you listen using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to answer those questions in the final portion of the webinar. If we don't get to your questions today, we'll be happy to follow up after the event. We'll also be sending you out an email with contact information and links that will help you learn more, as well as a link to a recording of the webinar when that gets posted. If you have something other than a question you'd like to contribute to the conversation, for example, posting links to related information, we encourage you to do that in the chat box. So with that introduction, let's get started with the video.
The COVID pandemic has underscored the need to more effectively expand affordable, high-performance broadband in our underserved communities, or as President Biden might put it, to build broadband better. In this presentation, we discuss one approach to doing this by deploying what are often referred to as open access fiber networks. To set the stage for that discussion, we'll spend a few minutes reviewing the history of what many of us have come to recognize as building broadband badly. A key point early in this history was passage of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which occurred as the commercial internet was beginning to explode beyond its academic roots following the launch of the first web browser. The goal of the act was to usher in an era of increased competition, investment, and innovation, which would lead to lower prices and better service. To do this, the act set in motion a process of deregulation in the telecommunications industry. Unfortunately, while the deregulation moved forward quickly, its hoped-for benefits fell well short of expectations, as many of us still experience today. The basic economics of building networks, combined with lawsuits and lobbying, led to a situation in which the only real competitors left standing were telephone and cable companies. Making things even worse was the fact that in many areas, either the telephone or cable company operated as an unregulated broadband monopoly, something economists and common sense tell us is a bad thing. For example, since the financial returns of extending their networks much beyond city limits were often insufficient to attract cable operators, telcos often enjoyed broadband monopolies in these more rural areas. And as unregulated monopolists, they, in turn, had no financial incentive to upgrade their copper networks to much faster and more reliable fiber optic technology. Because DSL was increasingly unable to match cable's broadband speeds, cable operators came to enjoy near monopoly market power in the areas they did serve, which led to high prices and often poor service. As unmet demand for broadband continued to increase in rural communities, wireless internet service providers, known as Wisps, began to fill in some of these gaps, but their coverage, speeds, and reliability remained limited, and their prices were often high. And since many of them had limited access to capital, their ability to invest in network expansion and upgrades was also limited. Making matters worse, the federal government wasted billions of dollars by subsidizing networks that were already or would soon be obsolete, a practice that continues to this day. Over time, fiber networks deployed by municipalities and electric cooperatives began to emerge in some areas, pointing the way to a public infrastructure approach to delivering high-performance broadband. But in many states, including Michigan, laws were passed to restrict or even prohibit municipalities from making these investments. The result, which we see today, is a patchwork of unserved and poorly served areas in smaller communities, and broadband prices that are among the highest in the developed world. As we've painfully seen during the COVID pandemic, this situation urgently needs fixing. What we need to fix this situation is a strategy that provides every one of us the level of connectivity needed to participate, prosper, and contribute as a member of society, not only today as we move through the COVID pandemic, but also in a future that will rely even more intensively on fast, secure, and reliable digital connectivity. That connectivity must reliably provide the level of performance needed to expand and improve telehealth, online learning, and telework services, including speed, security, privacy, and ease of use. It must also encourage socially valuable innovation and be readily upgraded to meet future requirements. And importantly, these capabilities must be affordable for everyone, as reflected in the universal service goal set in the 1934 Communication Act as a cornerstone of the nation's communication policy. That goal was to make available to all the people of the US a rapid, efficient communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges. To achieve this goal as we enter a new phase of the digital age will require a different strategy than the one that's been pursued but has failed to deliver during the 25 years since the 1996 Telecom Act became law. The good news is that we now have an opportunity to update our national, state, and local broadband strategies, thanks to a major expansion of federal funding. This includes the recently passed American Rescue Plan Act, which provides $220 billion to states and $130 billion to localities, and allows these funds to be used to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. In addition, the Act provides $10 billion to states to support capital projects. It also includes a mix of broadband-related funding channeled through federal agencies, including the Federal Communications Commission, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the Economic Development Administration, and the Department of Agriculture's Rural Utilities Service. As of early August, an infrastructure bill including $65 billion for broadband was being considered by Congress amidst intense lobbying by incumbent ISPs, hoping to avoid competition from high-performance community fiber networks. As we consider how best to invest this dramatic expansion of federal funding, we stand at a crossroads. If we travel down one path, we will continue building broadband badly by funding networks that are, or will soon be, obsolete and that continue to generate monopoly profits for incumbent ISPs. The result, as we've seen for the past 25 years, will be a lack of competition, high prices, poor customer service, and poor and unreliable network performance. And importantly, it will leave us with networks that are expensive to upgrade, constraining our ability to benefit from digital technology and compete in the global economy. The good news is that we have the option to build broadband better by deploying open fiber optic networks that provide fast, reliable, and symmetrical speeds and are less costly to maintain and upgrade. This path also leads to healthy competition, lower prices, and better service by focusing on community benefits rather than increasing ISP profits and market power. These benefits include high-quality access to telehealth and distance learning, and the ability to work productively from home and remotely and securely access banking, governmental, and other key services. To get a sense of why fiber is considered the gold standard in broadband networks and the only technology that qualifies as long-term infrastructure, let's consider two related factors: network capacity and future growth and demand for that capacity. This graphic compares the current maximum download speeds of different network technologies, including DSL, cable, 5G, and Starlink, the new generation of satellites currently in beta test mode. As the diagram makes dramatically clear, fiber's capacity is vastly greater than the capacity of all these other network technologies combined. And when its ability to support cost-effective upgrades is considered, fiber's effective capacity is virtually unlimited. Capacity is not fiber's only advantage. It also is the gold standard when it comes to network reliability, low maintenance costs, and ease of upgrading. If we want to be ready for whatever the future may bring, why would we deploy anything but fiber, especially when an increase in federal funding can help support a long-term investment in future-ready communication infrastructure? With bandwidth consumption increasing at roughly 40% per year, fiber's capacity and other advantages will be even more important in the future as demand explodes across multiple sectors of society, including those displayed on this slide. If our goal is to provide affordable, high-performance connectivity that supports healthy communities, healthy markets, and economic growth, we need to make a break from the policy approach reflected in the 1996 Telecom Act. As the past 25 years have clearly shown, that approach, which relied heavily on unregulated private network operators, particularly large telephone and cable companies and their legacy copper-based networks, was not up to the job. The good news is that a new and better model is emerging, thanks in part to technical advancements, such as software-defined networking and network virtualization, technologies that were originally developed and are now widely deployed in network data centers. When combined with fiber's vast capacity and robust reliability, these technologies enable a different model, one far better able to achieve and exceed the goals set by the Telecom Act when the age of digital connectivity was just beginning. We outline the key features of that model in the rest of this presentation. We start by giving the model a name that highlights its purpose: Community Empowerment Networks. We also give it an acronym-based nickname, Digital Commons, which emphasizes the open and shared nature of these networks. A helpful way to understand this model is to consider its parallels to the local road networks that transport people and physical goods and services throughout our communities. For example, they both expand opportunities to connect, compete, collaborate, innovate, and create value. Both have rules and mechanisms that support safety and equity. For example, to enhance safety, cars pull over for ambulances and stop for school buses. And our safety-focused speed limits apply to all of us, no matter how expensive our car. Both operate as nonprofit enterprises. Costs in both cases are shared across different types of users and stakeholders with an eye toward equity and sustainability. Community empowerment networks add to this several important benefits. Compared to physical roads, they are much cheaper to build, maintain, and add capacity. They are more climate and environmentally friendly. They employ advanced technology that was first developed and is now widely used in data centers. Known as software-defined networking and network virtualization, these technologies allow networks to add new lanes of traffic in the form of new services, new providers, and new capacity, quickly and inexpensively. This contrasts sharply with physical roads, where expansion tends to be very slow, very expensive, and often very disruptive. An important feature of digital commons is that it allows ISPs to enter, innovate, and compete in local markets without having to build their own network. To put this in perspective, consider what it would be like if UPS and FedEx, and maybe also Amazon, Ford, Walmart, and other companies, each built their own road network all the way to every home and business. That would be a huge waste of time and money. Though it costs a lot less to deploy fiber than to build a paved road, the principle is the same. As with physical roads, the most cost-effective way to support efficient markets and public services in the digital world is to deploy a single high-performance network open to all service providers in a non-discriminatory and non-profit basis. And because a digital commons supports easy market entry, reduces ISP costs, and encourages healthy competition among them, it leads to lower prices for end users. In Ammon, Idaho, for example, the city's open access fiber network, which offers a choice of service from 4 different ISPs, saw a 90% reduction in the lowest available price for gigabit speed service in less than 3 years of operation. This doesn't represent the full cost of that service, but as we discuss in a later slide, that total cost is still well below the industry average and may very well be the nation's lowest price for this very high-speed tier of service. The network in Ammon reflects a healthy blend of conservative and progressive values and the respective strengths of the public and private sectors. This is reflected in the following comments by the city's mayor and the CEO of a private ISP offering service on the network. The comments are part of a 20-minute video about the Ammon network available on YouTube and produced by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and Next Century Cities.
Is this appropriate for the public sector to enter in and potentially compete with the private sector, which of course is why we ended up with an open access network. That was really the motivation and drive, is so we could go to the public and say, we're not competing, we're actually enhancing competition.
I didn't think the city belonged in the fiber optic business. I'm one of those conservative people that believe government should be small. Having said that, I do know what the city is doing, and having watched what they've been doing after talking to them, working with them, and actually participating on the service, I'm happy with what they're doing.
The economics of the Ammon network summarized in this table reflect the success of this alignment of public and private sector strengths. When the network was being planned, the incumbent ISP was delivering 30 megabytes downstream and 5 megabytes upstream, with a maximum monthly data cap above which customers were charged extra usage fees. According to a survey conducted by the city at that time, this ISP's average customer was paying $93 a month, including extra fees triggered by the data cap. As the table shows, the total monthly cost for customers switching to the city's fiber network dropped nearly in half to less than $48, while the speed they received increased dramatically to 1,000 megabytes or 1 gigabit per second in both directions. Several things helped make this happen. The first was the city's ability to finance the network through a long-term, low-interest bond, which reduced the monthly payment needed to finance the network's capital cost. This contrasts with the much faster payback required for most for-profit ISPs. The second major factor was the impact of competition, as illustrated in the earlier slide, showing the sharp decline in ISP pricing during the Ammon network's first 3 years of operation. Helping to make this aggressive price competition economically viable for ISPs was the network's use of technology that reduced the cost of market entry and operation for participating ISPs. It's also important to note that when the bond that financed construction is paid off, the network's customers will be paying a total of less than $27 per month for symmetrical gigabit service. So what else does a community empowerment network do? As its name suggests, a community empowerment network shifts the balance of power from ISPs to network users and what we refer to as community service providers, or CSPs. Instead of controlling the local network as gatekeeper, toll collector, and rule maker, often in communities where they operate as a local monopoly, ISPs must now compete to earn the opportunity to connect customers to the public internet on the state-of-the-art high-performance fiber network. At the same time, a variety of private and public sector community service providers will be better able to deliver value by leveraging this same high-performance network. For example, medical practices will be able to more quickly create and more effectively manage secure private networks for their patients and practitioners, with schools able to do the same for their teachers and students. And governments, utilities, local business, and public safety organizations can use the network to improve the efficiency and security of their internal operations and their public-facing services. Community empowerment networks increase choice, ease of use, innovation, and efficiency. With only a few mouse clicks, network users can compare the prices and services of competing ISPs and sign up for, cancel, or change their service provider. They can also become community service providers using the network to provide fast, secure, reliable connections that empower their employees, customers, patients, students, and communities to better address their needs, interests, and goals. The following video provides a demonstration of this functionality. It is based on the automated provisioning and network virtualization technology developed by Entry Point Networks, which is used to serve customers in the Ammon, Idaho network discussed earlier in this presentation. In this video, we will demonstrate a network customer subscribing to an ISP service, then canceling that service and subscribing to a different ISP. We will then demonstrate the same customer self-provisioning a special circuit or private network over the same fiber strand. The first time a new customer accesses the network, they are taken to the subscriber portal where they can subscribe to available services. The customer selects internet service from the menu and is given a list of all providers and offerings. They choose a plan and click subscribe. They are taken through the specific terms of the ISP subscription. Once accepted, the ISP network is automatically provisioned. A few seconds later, their dashboard shows an active ISP subscription. They now have internet connectivity and can search the web. If for any reason the customer decides to switch their ISP, a couple mouse clicks and 5 seconds later, they are no longer subscribed to that ISP service. They can then repeat the subscribing process by selecting a different ISP option after accepting the service terms. The new ISP network is automatically provisioned, and a few seconds later, they are subscribed to a different ISP service as shown in their dashboard. Setting up an off-internet private network connection or special circuit is just as easy. The customer selects private LAN from the menu. They click through the network subscribing process, and a couple mouse clicks later, the network is provisioned. They are automatically routed to the network portal, where they identify as network host, entering their unique IP address and selecting the host button. Once the network is configured, they are given a private network code to share with those they invite to join their private network. Returning to the subscriber portal, the customer's dashboard now shows 2 services running over their single fiber network connection. By enabling community service providers to generate increased revenue, operational cost savings, and improved outcomes, a local digital commons encourages creative and win-win network cost sharing. For example, if a community's healthcare providers see enough value in having their patients connected to the network, they might be willing to contribute to its capital and/or operating costs. The same might be true for a community's school districts, large businesses, and public utilities. The need is great, but so is the opportunity. Consider empowering your community with a digital commons.
Okay. I hope that video was helpful as an introduction, and we're going to move on to a brief presentation by Bruce Patterson. I'll introduce the whole Entry Point team here now, and Bruce will speak for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. We've got, I'm pleased that we're able to get Jeff Christensen, who's the president and CEO of Entry Point, Devin Cox, who's the executive vice president for business development, and Bruce Patterson, who is the, I guess, the newest member of the Entry Point team, but he is a veteran of this model, and we're really pleased to have him here. He was previously the IT director in Ammon, Idaho, which was the first deployment of the Entry Point network, and we talked about it in that video. So he brings the perspective of the community. He was at the tip of the spear for the project in Ammon, and now he is working with Entry Point to help other communities develop their own version of what is sometimes referred to as the Ammon model, but it's basically, you know, we named it the Community Empowerment Network Model, but I think you'll get a sense and already have a sense of what we're talking about here. So Bruce, I'll give you the mic, and then we'll move to some Q&A and discussion after that.
Thank you, Mitch. I appreciate that. And I wanted to start by thanking you and your team. There's a lot of work in putting something like this together, so I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate everybody's time. So let me just kind of outline what I've been asked to do here as we dig in. I've been asked to talk about my history as we built this out in Ammon, with a focus on significant lessons that I learned as we went through that process in building an automated open access system. And then to also talk about the work that we're currently doing to move the model along and push more mature aspects of open access out to the end users. I've been asked to speak about that. And then we're going to focus on questions. And I think the questions are the part I want to get to. So I'm going to try and move through this content here in a pretty rapid fashion. So appreciate your attention. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Got a few slides to help focus the discussion here. So as Mitch mentioned, I started with the City of Ammon in 2004. In 2006, I took over as the technology director for the city. And about 2007, 2008, City Council tasked me with the assignment of improving broadband access and costs within the city. They felt that we were a little more rural. We're a neighborhood community to a larger area, metro, more suburban area, Idaho Falls. And prices were different in Idaho Falls than they were in Ammon for businesses, even though we're just separated by a road. So they had asked me to take that on as a focus and try and help them determine how best to change the broadband access and affordability within the city of Ammon. So as I worked on that, I became responsible for a strategy to help the city do that. That moved me down the path of having to become familiar with the legal aspects, what it is that the city could and could not do, help them draft ordinance, resolutions, and policies as we moved through the process over a decade. We looked at various financing options, public options, and we ended up using an improvement district. We looked at revenue bonds and a number of different things. I also had to become familiar with design, what the architecture of the fiber system would be, how we would operate it, how flexible we could make it, and what it would mean to try and introduce new services. Those were all considerations I was responsible for. We intended to outsource the construction, but as we moved down that path, it became apparent that using in-house staff from Public Works, we could build this infrastructure at a greatly reduced cost for the residents. And so it ended up that as we started to build in 2016 to the home, prior to that, we had used contractors to do all work. We actually purchased equipment, hired people, trained people, and started to take on construction to the home as part of our fiber to the home effort. That was unforeseen, but ended up to work out best for the end users. We had to stand up a production system and have providers, subscribers, and be able to separate the operations of the infrastructure and the actual services, and be able to do that in a way that was transparent to the end user so that when they had issues, they knew who to call to address those issues. And as we worked through this process, we applied for a lot of grants. We were successful in getting a couple of National Science Foundation grants that helped us with advancing technologies. And Ammon's also been successful in getting some COVID grants to deliver emergency Wi-Fi network to some key public points within Ammon that was helpful to some of the residents in connecting their children or to be able to do some work from home things. So we did manage some of those things. So that's my background and experience. I wanted to just outline what I learned as I went through this process. I think one of the first comments I would make is we intuitively know this. That's that the infrastructure is a natural monopoly, meaning once we put in this wireline infrastructure, the cost to enter that market and overbuild is dramatic. And you basically divide the subscriber base each and every time you add another wireline infrastructure, which drives the cost up for all of the users within the system. And so it became important to us, the city of Ammon, early on, that it was open access as a result, that it was open to all providers, that we did not encourage multiple overbuilds as a way to achieve choice or competition, because it didn't match with our second priority, which was affordability.
Hey, Bruce, this is Devin. Sorry for interrupting. We're seeing your entire desktop. You may want to run slideshow mode. We can see all of your dates coming up on your calendar.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
I appreciate that. Let me see if I can get there. How's that? Is that better?
It's coming. Yep, you're good.
Thank you, Devin. All right, folks, I apologize for that. The second thing I learned was that the digital divide really that we have today, the gaps, is really a result of the current models. And I think that I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I think that was very well summarized in the video you just watched. We saw the situations that created those models and how they're unable to address needs for ubiquity and affordability. Something else that was very important that started to happen around 2010 through 2013 is that all services started to move to Ethernet IP, meaning that people started to take video and voice services over the top using their internet connection, which meant that a system that was dynamic and could support multiple IP services was important. And so we focused on that. We also could see as a result of that, that unbundling was being driven by customer demand. It was a natural effect of the IP marketplaces that were being created on the internet, and that it would continue, and that any model we developed needed to be sustainable, recognizing that we would see this pattern continue based on customer demand. We also saw that fiber optic, as was well described in the video, was the only sound investment that would take the city 50+ years. Certainly, there are technologies like wireless and others that require less of an upfront investment, but the city intended to hold this infrastructure for decades. And because of that, fiber was the clear-cut winner when it comes to making that investment. We also had to dig in and take a look at the authority that the city had within the state of Idaho to finance, construct, own, and operate such an infrastructure. And those, from a legal perspective, are all specific grants of authority, meaning that in some states you might have the authority to do one of these things, like finance it, but you might not have the authority to operate it or own it after it's built. So these are important aspects that have to be considered for each and every community as they move forward. But we see a number of communities across the country, including in Michigan, where there are some hoops that a community has to jump through. We're seeing communities jump through those hoops and start to build their own infrastructure. The other thing that we saw was that the private model for return on investment wasn't adequate. And this was also pointed out in the video, that stretching the investment model to a public model, which will involve longer timeframes, lower interest rates for construction of the infrastructure, really changes the end price or the cost for the consumer. So if we use that public money to build infrastructure, then that infrastructure needs to remain public infrastructure and open to all. And we also made the decision that being symmetrical, meaning that upload speeds are equal to the download speeds. We could see that that was shifting. COVID actually dramatically proved that this was the case as people moved to online education and online meetings. Their upload speeds increased 4 times faster than their download speeds by most surveys as a result of COVID. So those were things that we felt were important that affected our decisions moving forward. So those are some key lessons learned. If I were to summarize what I think is the most significant, this is what I would say. Public strategy and leadership have been missing over the last decade. That's due to a number of reasons, and I won't go into those in detail, but it is very important that we recognize that this is the case. Why is it important that public strategy and leadership have been missing, and why is it critical that we get it? Well, I think it's important to frame that question in your mind by asking each of you, where do you want your community to be in 20 years? Think about the broadband availability and the services you expect to see over the next 20 years in your lifetime in your community. Will everything be over the top on the internet, or do you see very robust connectivity that you're not always aware of where the endpoints are, but you get the data and the services that you want on time and without problems? So as you think about that, what would you expect to cost for it, or pay for it, I should say? What should it cost? Would you expect to pay for all of these things piecemeal, a la carte, at a very high price? Or would you expect to have access to these things and be able to get them on demand as you wanted them at a very reasonable and low price once the infrastructure is paid for? So as you think about that, you might think about the strategy that your incumbent providers have. Where do they want your community to be in 20 years? Their business models dictate that they want to be your monopoly provider, and that incentive is correct. Commercially, that's exactly the right incentive for them and the right model. But the question remains, does that strategy align with your community strategy? And if the answer is no, how can you create a strategy that provides for the community's outcome and still respects the investment that's been made by the incumbents? And that's really where leadership can come in, is recognizing that there is a place for everybody at the table, but leadership dictates that we set the table and we let each of the stakeholders decide where they want to sit at the table. And a successful strategy would accommodate for those things. So in June of 2021, just a few months ago, I left my position at the city of Ammon and started with Entry Point Networks. My sole purpose in doing so was to try and help communities across the country take the funding that's available and build public infrastructure. Again, the core belief is from our part is that public money should result in public infrastructure. We now recognize we're at a point where private providers are saying we can't fill in these gaps without public assistance. If we grant them public assistance, it should be used to create public infrastructure that's open to all providers. So at Entry Point, I'm responsible to help with broadband planning, help advise on legal aspects, and find legal experts that can help a community go through how to establish a framework that fits within the state law that will allow them to finance, build, and operate some broadband infrastructure that would serve their community. I'm also responsible to help with network architecture and selection of contractors or equipment. We can do, I've helped communities with that, and we can do that if it's necessary, or simply point the community down the right path and let them do those exercises themselves. I also have experience, as was mentioned, in trying to understand the stakeholders, having the community be the operator and the owner of the infrastructure, what that responsibility looks like, what are the costs involved with maintenance and operation of the infrastructure. How do we entice providers, service providers, to come into this open system and compete? And then how do we make sure the subscriber understands what he's paying for and how to get help when he has problems? All of these things are new aspects in open access platforms, but they are things that we have solutions for, and there are strategies that can be implemented that will make them successful. And finally, at Entry Point, we're tracking all of the federal programs that are trickling through the state, from the recovery plan funding to other federal programs like the infrastructure bill that we're all waiting anxiously to see passed into law. So current work focus at Entry Point Networks is developing those broadband master plans for communities. We're engaged with quite a number of them across the country, and we'd be happy to help anyone that wants to do that. There are other entities as well out there that can help you with that. And you have fantastic resources in the state of Michigan, in Mitch and Merit Networks and your economic development agencies who are all participating in this. They're here in the meeting today. And Michigan has tremendous resources that if you're a community stakeholder, encourage you to reach out to those people and leverage those educational opportunities. For us at Entry Point and our automated software, we're working on improving the tools that are available to the stakeholders. We're implementing speed test functionality between the various network segments that would be available to everyone, from the provider to the operator to the subscriber. What that means in a practical application is the subscriber can tell if his fiber is up or down, and can tell if he has a problem with his connection to the internet or a connection with his home network or his Wi-Fi. So these are important tools for an open access system, and we are working on those, and we'll be releasing those new tools over the next few months. We're also have developed what we call a service provider in a box application. This is something that an ISP can use. So if an ISP has bandwidth they'd like to sell into a community, but struggles with automating the onboarding of a subscriber through the Entry Point system, because when that subscriber clicks in the Entry Point system, that link, and wants to subscribe, there is automation required on the part of the ISP. And if the ISP is challenged with that technical aspect, we basically have a solution that we call an ISP in a box that we can implement for them that will take care of that automation. And it gives them control over their bandwidth and how that gets provisioned to the end user. We are also focused at Entry Point on transactive energy and hospital from at home types of technologies. We believe those will benefit from private network links. You saw a demonstration of that in the video of how Entry Point enables that. We're automating that even further and making it possible for transactive energy to not take place across internet networks, but instead across a private network owned by the power company. We've demonstrated that in the lab, and we're working on implementing some of these installations in the US today. and hope to be able to push them forward as good examples of a superior way to do business for a power company or for a community that's interested in implementing transactive energy. The same thing would be true with the local hospital, being able to send patients home earlier. There have been studies performed where patient devices and sent home earlier, and it amounts to significant cost savings, and those devices are connected across the internet to the hospital. We're taking those devices and connecting them across the local fiber infrastructure so that they don't actually cross the internet, which improves security and reliability and the cost actually for both the hospital and the patient. So those are things that we're working on developing. That gives you some idea of our current work. So we've outlined kind of the history that led us to the point we're at. We've talked about important lessons that we've learned, we feel that we've learned along the way, and our current work. So with that, we're going to move towards questions, and we hope to have a nice discussion and answer any questions anyone has. So I'm going to turn this back over to Mitch and his team, and we'll be available to participate.
Okay, well, thank you, Bruce, very much. I actually learned some things there. I hope others did as well. We've got a few questions, a few in the chat box and one in the Q&A. We'd prefer if you could put them in the Q&A, no need to for the ones that are already in the chat box. And I'll go ahead and read the questions and invite more questions for people if people have them. Okay, so the first question we've got is, who owns and manages the CPE, the customer premise equipment? If you can dynamically change the retail ISP. Okay, I think that's reasonably clear. Whoever wants to respond to that from the EntriPoint team, go ahead.
So the CPE equipment obviously has intelligence there that enables software-defined networking, meaning it has to support some standard protocols. Having said that, it's really just a white box network appliance. You can get it from multiple vendors. In answer to your question as to who owns it, it needs to comply with the network operator's infrastructure requirements, meaning that typically the network operator makes sure and purchases that and installs it in the home initially. But in terms of ownership, quite honestly, that would depend on your business model as the infrastructure owner. In Ammon, it's owned by the city, and the city is responsible as part of the user fees to maintain and keep that updated or replace it if it fails. However, it could be very much like a cell phone, meaning that you could offer the homeowners the opportunity to purchase any number of devices depending on what type of functionality and performance they want, and they could be responsible for it. So that needs to be clearly spelled out in your ordinance and your operating framework so that the end user understands who's responsible to purchase and replace that should it fail. So hopefully that's a clear enough answer.
Okay, the next question we have is, are there examples of where this has been done in phases, beginning with publicly owned land or assets to address potential permitting preemption challenges?
So I will answer the question as I understand it. And if I miss the target here, I encourage you to point that out to me. But in Ammon, it was very incremental. With most of the communities we're working with, it's incremental. And we do focus on connecting public geographic locations that are publicly owned, because the anchor tenant for most of this ends up being the anchor institutions, the community anchor institutions. So in Ammon, we connected city facilities. They included city-owned municipal buildings, parks and recreational buildings. They included all of the water utility sites, including wells, lift stations, and so forth. We connected all of the wastewater facilities, again, that included catch basins and pumping facilities. And we used that connectivity to create private networks that serve those utility functions. That was number one. And then from those geographic locations, we created what we would consider to be access or serving nodes that the communities actually connect back into. So benefiting the community and serving those community needs and improving the reliability of the utility operations while driving down the cost, because we actually offloaded monthly bills to outsource all that connectivity. That was a key part of what we did initially. And that means as well that the city and the utility functions are actually embedded into this installation. That was done first. And then from there, strategically, the neighborhoods were chosen based on demand and built out too. So I hope that answers your question, but actually you're exactly right. You do need to start as an incremental build and get your foundation in place.
Okay, we've got another question. There's another one that relates to, well, this one is concise, so I'll start with this one. How can communities know prior to construction of an open access network what or how many ISPs will participate in the fully constructed network? I think that's an important question, which you've addressed to some extent, but if you could dig into that a bit more, that would be helpful.
That is an excellent question. And we find that it's one of the challenges that every community looking at open access has to deal with. And oftentimes, the smaller the community, the larger that variable looms for them as they contemplate building out. So at Entry Point, we're working on solutions that will allow us to take the marketplace that gets developed in one area to another community. What that does is creates an instant scale, meaning that if we have a successful open access marketplace that's serving a customer base of 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 customers, that marketplace has established pricing. And if we can take that marketplace and bring it to a rural community, and even if they only have 50 homes, those packages and pricing can be delivered to that community. So we are focused on that. We have some strategic things we're implementing, and we are successful in some communities. For example, the pricing that's available in Ammon is being made available in some other cities in the state of Idaho at the same price as those cities start to do business. And again, you have some fabulous assets in the state of Michigan that are looking at this same problem, like Merit and the universities. And they're working on this same problem too. So my advice would be is if this is a path you want to walk down, have a conversation with us or someone else that is working on open access, and we can help you come up with a strategy and do that initial legwork of determining what is your marketplace going to look like and what will the pricing be. And we can get that up front to give you confidence as you make investment in building such an infrastructure. So if that's of interest to you, that's exactly the work we're doing, is to give you surety as you build out.
Great, Bruce. A related question. Let me see the part that's additional here. Well, I guess the bottom line is, if users can change so easily their ISPs, how do you make this attractive to the ISPs? I think you've addressed that, but this is sort of a slightly different aspect to it. Is, again, it's the ISP's perspective. And if switching is so easy, and I know from my background, sort of churn is a factor in the broadband industry, in the telecom industry, cable industry, whatever you want to label it, for many, many years. And I think what you're saying, and please elaborate, or Devin, Jeff, that by reducing the cost and streamlining all the operations, the churn becomes less of an issue. In other words, the economics basically change fundamentally for ISPs, and they need to understand that, but they also, as you're discussing, need to be empowered to adapt to a somewhat different model. And already it sounds like that's happening with some ISPs. So if any of you want to add to that, please do.
One of the key aspects of correctly implementing this is that the ISP enters the market with basically no to such an extremely small investment. The churn really is only affecting the contracted bandwidth they want to deliver to your community. So the risk is greatly lowered because they are not having to pay back an upfront investment. So that's one aspect that's key. However, in Ammon, we did find that they were very nervous about this. And I can tell you after 5 years of data, customer churn, even though it's extremely easy to change, we do not see that happening. The only time customers leave their subscription is when that particular ISP has an outage or a problem. And if it's prolonged for longer than an hour or two, what we see then is they will cancel, change their subscription, and move to another ISP because the fiber is still functional. However, having said that, over the last 2 years, we've seen a very interesting dynamic. We saw one particular ISP that had about a 25% market share have a 4-hour outage. During that time, he lost about 10% of his customer base. However, 15–20% of his customer base subscribed to a second service and never left him. So there's an important aspect here. Within the system, you can subscribe to 2 ISPs at the same time. And basically the change involves unplugging from the port one ISP is in and plugging into the second port. You need to keep in mind that you can get a 15 meg by 15 meg service for $2.88 in the Ammon system. So what many of this particular ISP's customers did was go subscribe to the cheapest service available and move over for a couple of days. And then when the outage was over, they moved right back to their primary ISP. Where this gets interesting is most of them still have those subscriptions. So they did not go and cancel it. They continue to subscribe to 2 ISPs. This was something we saw prior to this because some homes take an ISP for business and then they put their children and their streaming services on a different ISP. And that is possible within this system. And as you can see, it doesn't change the infrastructure cost or the fee charged by the city. It really only involves an additional few dollars a month, just like getting Hulu in combination with Netflix. Really only involves just paying for that additional service. So churn, honestly, has not been a problem for the ISPs. And if that's something that a community wants to explore, I'm happy to connect any of the communities with the providers that exist in Ammon, and they would share their experience with you. And I think you'd find that very interesting.
Okay, we've got a few more questions I hope we can get to here. This is, thank you, Johannes, for your question. I'm just going to read it here. Pointing out from what I know, Ammon has an average population density of about 2,100 people per square mile, typical for many communities. Have you calculated how the cost model would change for municipalities with lower population density or very rural areas where the population density might be as low as 28 per square mile? Good question.
It is a good question. And yes, working with some of these communities, they have a lot. It's a significantly different density. So we do have those and we can model those for you. We can do those designs or share with you how that affects cost. It is important to note that some of the most significant pieces of the cost are the actual physical labor to install it, right? And so going through those properties and extending them does add to the cost, but you're not adding some of the material costs that would be involved with creating the port to drop the fiber to the home or the electronics at both sides. So it will elevate the cost, but oftentimes it's not as much as one might think, but it is important to model it to verify that. I think we're also hopeful that with the federal funding that's out or will be made available, that those that live in what we would define and what the federal government defines as a high cost area will have some financial assistance to help with getting some of those harder to reach areas built out over the next 3 to 4 years. The important aspect to any of that federal funding is you need a plan. So to even make an application, it's very important that you have some type of a feasibility study or plan that you can show your costs and that you also have an operational model so that you can prove sustainability. That enables a community to have a very credible grant application. So we would encourage people, get in early on that curve so that you're ready to make application for that money.
And I've got another question that follows up on this. I'm going to go ahead and read it. I agree with the technical, and it's from Robert Sloan. Thank you, Robert, for the question. I agree with the technical merit of fiber and also understand the cost and amount of time it takes to deploy fiber to the premise, to every premise. The final mile is a substantial challenge. I work with public utilities operating wholesale fiber networks in rural areas. Cost per premise to reach the last 20 to 25% of their service areas increases by as much as 400 to 500%. So the question is, do you see a place for wireless fiber hybrid networks to help bridge the gap until the fiber to the premise can be achieved? And any additional perspective to share on this final mile challenge?
I really think that the question you're asking comes down to the policy that the public entity that's responsible for helping that area has to debate on and has to make a decision. So I think different areas are going to make different decisions about the role that wireless would play. But I think you're also asking us, meaning Entry Point, do we feel like wireless has a place? And the answer is yes. We do believe that there is a place for wireless, and there are times when it makes sense economically to get the service there. However, at our core, and I think most of us would agree with this, wireless to some extent really kicks the can down the road. If a property has electricity, we've built to it once, and we did it in an affordable fashion. And the way we did that was we didn't introduce competition by running multiple power supplies to the home. And we did it using public funding that had low interest rates and longer windows of time to pay it back. So the question should be asked is, can we implement those types of tool sets to get fiber there? Because fiber costs far less to extend than the power grid did. What it really is going to take is a strategy and public leadership. We could get a lot further than we are with fiber. So the caution that we would throw out is the best investment remains fiber. However, there are times when in policy or in funding, that simply isn't possible. And if it's absolutely critical and essential that you pick up an area and get some service there, wireless might be a viable choice.
And we've got another very good and important question. I'll just summarize it. It's basically, it relates to the rules of the road in terms of state policy and specific, since most of our audience is in Michigan and focused on Michigan. The question relates specifically to Michigan policy, state policy. So I don't know, I can address a little bit of the Michigan context, but also you folks have been talking to other state, communities in other states, and there's a whole hodgepodge of different policies in different states. So I'll sort of summarize my understanding of the Michigan context, and then maybe the Entry Point folks can jump in with a broader context of how this solution could apply to Michigan, and also what else is going on in other states. So I actually have, I'm going to see if can I share my screen here? Let me see. Okay, this is a slide that I took out of the presentation because I wasn't sure we would need to go in this direction, but basically, can people see it?
Yes.
Yeah, so the title is Dealing with Michigan's Roadblocks to Digital Road Building. And these are the three that I focused on. One is the Metro Act compliance, which perhaps a lot of you are aware of. And my sense of this is that this could be a fairly natural part of the planning process, that there's certain things a community needs to do to deploy a municipal network. And I think a lot of it is simply good due diligence, pointing you in a careful direction. So I think those are hoops you want to jump through anyway, steps you want to take. There's also, I don't know if it's been introduced, maybe someone else attending here knows, in the current session of the legislature, but it's been proposed in the past where, similar to the local improvement district, is that the the term used in Idaho, where in addition to being able to do a millage, you can also create a special assessment district that would be more customized, if you will, for where the network would be built. And that all that requires is a simple amendment to the existing special assessment district law. And that's something that, you know, in my view, is something that should be done. But there's been resistance to that in the legislature, excuse me there. And then, in my view, unfortunately, the current law controlling the terms of eligibility for the state grant program, which I believe is, I remember the acronym, Connecting Michigan, CMIC, I forget, it's too many acronyms for me to remember. But it says that pretty explicitly, governmental entities or educational institutions or their affiliates cannot own, purchase, construct, operate, or maintain a communications network or provide service to any residential or commercial premises. So one of the pending questions now we face is, at the federal level, we've got a process that's going through the legislature, and there's lots of politics around exactly what the terms will be with regard to the allocation of funding, any preemption, prioritization of funding. So we have to wait for that to shake out. But a concern I have is that at the state level, if federal funding goes through the state program, that it may be that this restriction will be applied to federal funding that flows through the state program. So I think, to me, my perspective is that's a really important political issue in the state. And I think it would be a very big mistake for that to remain the case. And there's other things about that particular law, but I think it's that restriction, that exclusion, that's really a problem. So that's the context that we face in Michigan, which is pretty uncertain, I guess I would say, with some risk and some very positive possibilities. So I'll leave it there. And Bruce or Devin or Jeff, if you want to comment on it from the broader perspective of different models that are feasible, even in states that have restrictions that are problematic from the perspective of a nice, clean Ammon model to be applied, if you will.
I think your synopsis was excellent, Mitch, and your observations are spot on. I think we would all agree that the recovery plan funding that's being delivered to the public entities, counties and cities, specifically has a grant within it that you can use that money for a broadband capital project, meaning that there's some implied authority to invest in infrastructure with that and take on a project. My recommendation would be for a public entity striving to do that, that they might reach out to the Attorney General's office in Michigan as an example and say, here's how we would like to spend this money. There's this implied grant. Could you give us some kind of a legal memo expressing whether or not from the state's perspective or not we could use it for that? Those are some things that we could attempt and try, but clearly some adjustments to the law, as you highlight, would clear the path and take care of that uncertainty. So ultimately, I think your analysis was right on.
Yeah, and one other question I have for you, I know in other states, you've at least explored different models, and one of them is a cooperative. And I wonder, which is basically wouldn't be, in my reading of the law, wouldn't be excluded by this. I know, and it has its own, hurdles, et cetera, but any other models that if the legislative, if the legal issue can't be overcome directly, it can be worked around, that would still be consistent with sort of the principles that we're talking about here, community empowerment network model.
Yes. So in answer to your question, yes, we're seeing that being contemplated. I mean, in the various states, you have things like, as you mentioned, a cooperative. Mutual is another term for another public entity where there's kind of shared ownership by the people that actually receive the service, or a utility district at times. Depending on the frameworks that are available in the state law, we can help analyze that. but it is entirely possible. For example, we've seen it contemplated and it's being acted upon by some cities where they'll actually, due to the state law, contemplate co-op, create a co-op, and the city council is actually the board for the co-op. So it just creates that layer of public ownership where it's still the city can support it, and it is expressly allowed within the recovery plan bill that if you want to invest in broadband capital infrastructure, that can be delivered to another nonprofit or political subdivision of the county or city. So creating that co-op is a way to kind of channel those funds and get your foundational seed money to start that operation there, or at least that foundational infrastructure. So the law does provide those paths. Again, we would walk through that process and make sure that they have legal representation that concurs with that so that they're secure in being able to start.
We've got another question here, and please, we allocated 90 minutes, so if there are more questions, don't hesitate. If you can hang around, I know people have other things they need to do, but we welcome questions. And as I said earlier, if we can't answer all the questions now, we will follow up. Does Entry Point own and operate fiber networks, or is your role to be a new intermediary that helps orchestrate other players, for example, communities, ISPs, and users, by providing planning and network virtualization services?
Excellent question. I'm glad you asked it because I should have made it clear. We own no fiber asset and we do not intend to ever own it. We strongly advocate for public ownership. Our sole role is to help these open access public networks get built, because the challenge to their success, as we've already discussed, is scale. But we believe that it will serve as a very powerful solution to close some of the divides we're facing and actually improve services and costs for all of us. So we advocate that that infrastructure remain in the public ownership. We have no interest in building anything that we would own. What we would like to do is have you consider us as your partner in using software technologies to open that infrastructure up, to make it economically feasible to have multiple services and to be able to introduce innovation and new services at virtually no cost using software. That is our sole business driver.
Okay. So another question, how do you overcome ISP providers' high price in rural areas and lack of companies to construct lines, facilities, etc., without a high cost from other regions? I think there's two questions there. I'm not sure what the first question is exactly asking, but I think, but if someone else understands it, that's great. But I think, to me, the question about companies to construct lines in rural areas is, I think, an issue that everyone, doesn't matter who you are, even if you're AT&T, apparently you will face those kinds of things. So you want to take a crack at that question? I believe it's from someone who is active in rural areas, because it was an earlier, more of a question from that person earlier.
Sure. That is a big challenge, and it can be complex, and there are multiple ways to address it. The way that we found most successful is talk to your neighbors. If you're rural and you're small, you're surrounded by others that are rural and small. Talk to your neighbors. As an example, in Idaho, we found the greatest success in getting a number of rural communities to come to the table, and they actually got the county to come to the table. And as that grew up, they started to see that they had common goals and they were dealing with common problems, and it actually expanded into a neighboring county. And they created a coalition, and that coalition has been far more effective in bringing contractors in at better pricing and also getting the state to help with some funding. So all of these things are still in progress, but certainly the dynamic changed. So if you are rural, I would strongly encourage you, reach out to your neighbors. And if you want some help in how to develop that, we are certainly happy to share experience, frameworks that could be used to create an organization if that's what you desire, or frameworks to create relationship agreements that allow you to pool your funding and deliver better broadband to your small communities. So that is what we feel like would help to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to jump in with something about the skill labor constraints, that bottlenecks, and just, I don't know who, all the people on the call or who you know, whatever, but I would love to see something in Michigan that community colleges take on training for the technical skills required more aggressively. And I think one of the things, and I don't want to get too much into the technical weeds, but the entry point technology, I would say your preference, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to use active Ethernet technology. And my understanding is that that technology is a more sort of, you could say, generic skill set than, let's say, a proprietary passive optical network. And it seems to me that community colleges could either enhance existing programs or have an IT training program that could provide skills to help maintain these kinds of networks. And also it applies to broader IT opportunities. So, you know, if there's anyone who is involved in community colleges, I know in some earlier roundtable call I was on, there was someone from one of the community colleges. So anyway, I'll just throw that out if any of the entry point folks want to comment on that, or I can move on. Okay.
Mitch, I'll just say, Wisconsin actually does have a community college with this skill set up in the Superior area. So there's some of that is starting to emerge. So it's a good comment, good insight. And then as far as, I don't know if we fully answered the high prices for ISPs. This may not have been clear, but we're in multiple states, we're working on mechanisms that will allow everybody in the state to access the same pricing and the same ISPs. So I don't know, we'll go further at this point, but we're working on statewide structures. We hope that that will become a nationwide structure. So start regionally, grow it to state, but make it so that people can reliably count on both the pricing and the availability of ISPs on regional, statewide basis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Jeff. Anyone else have any questions? I had another question that slipped my mind. So, oh wait, we've got, hold on, let's see. Oh yeah, someone made a comment here. Oh, it's in the chat box as well. The Fiber Broadband Association has an effort to build a nationwide program for the development of fiber technicians. Glad to hear that. Question here. How secure are these networks? Can you talk about security issues? And I'll just leave it at that.
So there's a couple of key components we have to recognize about security. Actually, securing the service falls upon the service provider. But what we can do if we're the infrastructure operator is we can secure the infrastructure. So what we can do is authenticate devices and not allow unexpected devices to actually plug into the fiber. And if that device actually gets unplugged and moved to another location, or something odd were to happen within the infrastructure, we would get an alert or a warning. So those are the areas that we provide security. So just to be clear, as an example, when you do a transaction with your bank, it gets secured within the browser when you do SSL and you see the little padlock. So it has to be secured end to end. We cannot do that because we provide the infrastructure and not the service. So it's an important distinction that we can secure the actual infrastructure, and we can secure the software defined virtual networks, but we cannot secure the actual services. That will still come down to the service providers. So from our perspective, they're very secure because we secure what we can, but we still need to rely on those that are delivering the service to secure their portion of it. We actually think we can improve security for a number of these services and providers. As I mentioned, transacted energy, we can secure that by not ever letting it cross the public internet, meaning it's not even available to be snooped or spoofed or blocked, they would actually have to cut the physical local fiber because it's not actually exposed in a public network like that. It's a private network on that same infrastructure. So we can improve the security for them, but they still have to manage their own end to end. So if that didn't answer the complete question, let me know, but that's how I would answer what you've asked.
Great. I remembered my other question that it came up at various points. If you're a community that's interested in this model, but you really don't want to take on, let's say, a very small community or whatever the reasons, and you'd like to hire or have as a partner a private operator that won't be an ISP, but basically will play the role of the network operator, sort of manage the roads, if you will. Any thoughts that you can share beyond what you've already shared about that kind of model? It would be, the owner might be a municipality, but the operator, the network operator, would manage the network. Any wrinkles there, complications, or benefits of the particular approach that you're taking to that?
Scale is always a factor. So for a very small community, it can be a challenge. What we do is we walk the community through a process of going to an RFP to try and determine what it's actually going to cost to outsource operations. It's very easily done. It's not complicated because that's part of virtualization. We can give you the controls to manage the network wherever you would like them to be, in the network or even outside the network. So we can do that, and you can outsource it. You just need to figure out what that costs so that you can roll it into your operational model and into your fee structure. And we can help you with that. It might be that you even just want to partner, as I said, with the rural communities around you and then outsource the operations for the entire thing as a whole. And again, we can virtualize that, present these siloed infrastructures that belong to individual owners and present it as one wide dynamic network for the purposes of management. So that's all things we can do in software that we're very good at. So again, just walk through the process. What does it cost? And if you don't want to manage it, you just want to own it, we can certainly create that separation easily.
Okay, well, we're getting close to ending time, and I don't see any other questions. And probably you've given everyone here, myself included, a lot to digest. So maybe we should let that gestation begin. Thank you, Entry Point team, for joining us. We're really appreciate the opportunity to share this approach to networking, to actually leveraging the money, the federal money that's coming, and building a network that can serve the community needs for many, many years. So thank you very much.